Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Wake me up when September ends.
Oh, I should have said it. Billy Joel. Billy Joe, not Joel. Joe. It's confusing, but
No, that's not
it's Green Day.
Green Day. Yeah, okay.
But Billy Joe is the lead singer
yeah,
of
that's
Green
where.
Day.
Okay, when you said Billy Joel, that's why
I let that L kind of come out there, but I didn't mean to.
It's September.
I thought it was.
It is September. That's
Did
true.
you say when September ends?
But yeah,
Yeah.
so you should be woken
I'm
up.
gonna be sleeping for the next month.
Yeah, I was like,
when it ends. It was just the thing that popped in my mind, knowing today is the first day of September. I was
can't
gonna
believe
sing
it.
"Do You Remember" the 21st night of September, but I feel like I'll save that for a couple weeks
okay.
Oh. Okay.
if I'm awake.
Okay, yeah, save that one. Don't forget it. Put
He
that
always
one in your
keeps us on our
pocket.
toes, Eric.
Yep.
Just never know what
Never
to
know what
expect
Alex
from-
is going to do.
That's why he's in the middle, so we can kind of.
Corral him.
Yeah.
That song has just been stuck in my head because if you follow us on social media, not the podcast, but CCC Omaha.
Mm-hmm.
There's been some like fun dance, like wedding dance wedding dance, like Christian wedding dance dances, like to biblical kind of themes that one of our
Burning bush.
the burning bush, the baptizer,
Feet washing.
and it's been to the song by Earth, Wind, and Fire, September.
Yeah.
And they're pretty funny. And so that song's kind of been stuck in my head for the last few weeks. So that's where it came from.
Thanks for sharing that.
It's not just totally at random.
Yeah, makes sense.
Thank you.
Well, kind of.
Yeah. Anyways. All right. Well, Alex, do we have any voicemails?
We do. We have a voicemail. I'll play it and we'll listen.
Good morning, guys. Thank you so much for this podcast. I found a lot of inspiration and really uplifting parts of my day from listening to you. I have some stuff going on with my in-laws. My husband and I have been together for quite a while.
Uh-oh.
Oops.
Technical errors.
Technical errors.
Oh, no.
Should we just roll that podcast clip again?
What?
Just start it over at the voicemail.
What podcast clip?
No, the voicemail.
Oh, why?
Because I went out of it.
Oh,
That's why.
okay. Austin, do you
Or
know?
do you want us to restart?
Well, I think we can just say, here's the voicemail. Do you know what it was on? Or did you switch it, Austin?
You can say, here's the voicemail, and then I'll switch it again.
Here it is, and we will listen.
And his family.
Sorry, one more time. Let me restart it all.
All right.
Good morning, guys.
You ready? We're going to do this. Take 4. All right, here's the voicemail. We'll listen.
Good morning, guys. Thank you so much for this podcast. I found a lot of inspiration and really uplifting parts of my day from listening to you. I have some stuff going on with my in-laws. My husband and I have been together for quite a while, and his family has been very draining on us. Physically, mentally, financially, and I need some help with establishing good boundaries while also respecting my husband and his want to be there for his family. So I just need some advice and how I can both be supportive but also remind him that our family unit is important and we need to maintain that first before he runs to help his extended family. So, do you have any advice or wisdom in that regard? I would so appreciate it. Thank you.
Wow.
It's kind of heavy, stressful stuff.
Yeah. First, thank you for trusting us with that question. I mean, really is, we get to answer a lot of fun, kind of voicemails and things like that. And from time to time, one like this. And appreciate the trust and glad to know that, this has been inspirational and uplifting part of your day. But man, yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm kind of reeling because it's so raw and it's such a real question, and I'm trying to think about it in my own circumstances and life, and some of that. So,
yeah, I think it's tough when you are in a marriage and you have to kind of realize that this is a new family unit that you're starting, and there are some boundaries that have to be set, and I think sometimes that just takes time, and it does take a lot of maturity, and sometimes it's hard, I think, for the person when it's their parent and they're having that connection, or it's hard to separate that from the current family that you're building. So it feels like it's still all just one thing, and so I think learning to set those boundaries is really important, but it's also just really challenging because you have to respect everybody involved. Like, you can't just start fights or be disrespectful or, do that sort of thing. But yeah, that puts you in a really, I think, challenging situation. And I think as this being your husband, and I mean, you have to respect him, and I guess talk about it. That's the first thing I can think of is like talk through it the best, in the most calm way you can without being accusatory. But I don't know, Jess, what are your thoughts?
I think that when you're getting married, especially for me, and I think like all of us going back to when we were first getting married, or even in those first couple of years, I never thought about my in-law relationship, because you kind of think about getting married and bringing this person into your family and into your life. And so I think it's really not talked about often, especially until it's an issue or until things start showing up. And so around it is often stress, and it's often conflict. And so then you're working through a relationship like already feeling tense or defensive or something like that. And so I always say you go back to the basics. Like, when you're looking at the whole thing, can be very overwhelming and seem like maybe this person is choosing all of them and none of me, which often isn't true, but it feels like that. And that's totally valid. And so I think it's going back to the basics of, we're a team. I love you. I chose you. You chose me. I didn't maybe realize that in that was all of your family and all of mine. It's part of it. But going back to the basics, I think, is the first of, okay, we're a team. What does that look like?
Yeah.
I think talking about that is great. And then I think using statements like, I feel, or this is what this does to me, versus like you choosing them, you choose them, or you always do this, and using like accusatory statements just already makes a very defensive conversation. And then I think as far as setting boundaries, it's what boundaries do we need to set to be in relationship with our in-laws? So we want to see them once a week. What does that look like? Do we, instead of staying all day, do we set a time limit? Or, when they call and we're having a conversation, we finish our conversation before you pick up. It's kind of like, we're not sure, like even in that call, what's causing the issues. I mean, it sounds like choosing someone else, but we don't know how that is. But it's like, I think being able to communicate through that. And I think also like having those conversations to hear the other person.
Yeah. Empathy goes a long way. I think,
and I think
go ahead.
It's hard not to like think the worst of the other person, because it feels hurtful and defensive. And like, even like Ben and I, when we have arguments, because yes, those happen, like it's like, okay, I'm not your enemy, you're not my enemy. And just like, even in my mind thinking like, okay, he's not my enemy, like we choose each other, we're a team. But I think like going back to those basics, we have to revisit those a lot, even though we'll be married 13 years this year. I know you guys are farther along than us, but I think it never hurts to go back to those basics of like communication and things like that.
I have so many thoughts just swimming around in my head. So you guys, and even hearing you share, your perspective gives me even more. But I think one, as we were speaking, and and talking mostly about marriage and in-laws, that's where a lot of the subject, comes to play. And so if you're somebody that's still stuck with us and you're not married, or maybe that's not, you're single or whatever that might be, I think this is a reality even outside of being an in-law, like just making the journey to adulthood. I think this just naturally begins to happen. You start to separate from your nuclear family, your family of origin, in a lot of different ways as you become more independent. And maybe that independence grows with another family, or you just as a person, and you move and, you start to recognize a lot of those things. And so I think, so it is more common, like those feelings, than I think sometimes we often feel like it might be. But yeah, I think a lot of the things you were saying there, Jess, one of the phrases that I try to remember is that I'm fighting for this person, not with this person. Like I'm fighting for my marriage, not, with my spouse, fighting for my spouse. And then there is a real enemy that's trying to, create division and wedges. But I do think that there's probably a few factors that really might come to play in something like this. One of them was we had a conversation with another counselor at City Care, Diane how do you say her last name? Amstutz, about codependency. So I don't know, like I'm not going to, do some kind of armchair counseling here, but there could be, in that situation, maybe some codependency on a family or members, that could be happening there. So just as a perspective, that could be a podcast episode to listen through, or maybe you and your spouse to listen through and kind of say, hey, maybe there is some of this, and what are some of the steps? She gave some great steps towards, independence there. And so that could just be
I think another thing is just cautioning against, listen to that, but don't bring it as ammunition into the argument. 100%. Like I think that's just a risk that could be there. Like, hey, this is what you're doing. Because I think when you use empathy and you put yourself in that person's shoes and you realize, because I think relationships are so different. Like one person's relationship with their parents could be much more strained than another. And if someone feels very close to their parent, it might not be codependency. It just might be a closeness that you don't understand or you don't relate to, Yeah. And so I think understanding why they feel this need to help or be involved the way that to the level that they are will maybe help you get like to the root of the problem and then talk through it too. So I just think, communications is a huge thing there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think, so I get to do weddings every so often. And one of the things that I've learned as I've done it is you have to have a lot of these conversations on the front end that we just naturally don't have. Like we're always like, it's the season of love. It's the season of marriage. It's bliss. It's all of those things. And we want to keep it that way. We want to keep it comfortable, and we think love's going to sustain us and all the feelings, but it's just not, that's not reality long term. And all of us are coming from different families of origin, have different expectations that we're walking into a marriage with, from what in-laws are going to be, how we spend money, how we're going to discipline kids, how we're going to, turn our toilet paper, like from serious things to silly things. And all of those can cause conflict within a marriage. And so I really think if you're somebody that's not married, like doing the difficult work ahead of time to have these conversations are going to save in the long run a lot of pain.
Totally.
There was a recent poll by Forbes that asked divorcees what are things they thought would have saved their marriage. And 63% of them said a better understanding of the commitment of marriage prior to marrying, which I think is fascinating, because I think a lot of people go into marriage not understanding the commitment on a lot of levels. Commitment to this person over, others. Obviously, in the Christian belief, we said Jesus and then this person, but commitment to this person, which I think is a fascinating, stat. And number two is a better understanding of values and morals of their partner prior to marrying. And so I think a lot of those happen through conversations up front and communication, like you were saying, Eric. And so yeah, it's a big deal.
Another thing you could do is pray about it. Not to make a transition there. But yeah, thank you for your voicemail. And today we are going to be talking about prayer. And so maybe there's something to that too that we can dive into. So be sure to stick around for that. As we promised earlier, we were going to be talking about prayer today. And this was really it maybe seems random. Like we talk about a lot of sometimes very specific topics on this show. Why kind of a broader subject? The catalyst really was this relevant article that was published in June titled, Why Is It So Hard to Pray? And just from that title, you may be wondering, what is this about? What do you mean it's hard to pray? And I think it's a really honest perspective. Eddie Becker is the author of this article, and I think it's a very honest perspective of how loosely we throw that term around, or what do Christians actually mean? There's great examples in the article of someone posts something's going on in their family. It's family trauma or sickness or something like that, and people in droves will post praying, prayer, pray hands, And is that just kind of like, oh, you sneezed, God bless you? Is that kind of our reaction now in Christian culture, where we're just like, oh yeah, well, we're praying for you? I mean, I think that, I don't know, personally for me, and maybe I'm getting ahead of ourselves here, but I think sometimes I'm pretty cautious with that, just because I don't want to say it if I don't mean it. And I've always been very convicted of that. Like, I don't want to just be like, oh, we'll be praying for you, just to make myself feel better about an uncomfortable situation. Like I don't want to just take the easy way out a lot of times, but then I feel like I've been in certain circles where it's made me out to be the not as holy of a Christian as others, because I don't always go for that as my first response in the tool belt. But I don't know. It is a very interesting thing. And I think when we honestly talk about prayer as Christians, you start peeling back all these layers of nuance where it's like, how do people pray? What's the right way to pray? What happens when prayers aren't answered? What does that mean? So there is a lot there, and hopefully we can unpack a fair amount of that today. But yeah, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on this topic? Or, I mean, if we want to jump right into it, do we want to talk about personal examples of where we struggle to pray?
I think it feels like a broad topic, but it's one of those things that I feel is simple but not easy. That, okay, I think we get it, like prayer at the heart, like if I'm explaining it to my kids, or as a middle school pastor, it's simple. It's talking to God. It's listening to God. I think that's probably the part we don't talk about as much, and we'll maybe get into more, is like, it's not coming to God with, this eloquent speeches and all of that. Yet there are very formational prayers, so there's this simplicity to it that we know, we should, and it should be a part of the Christian life. But it's not easy, because there are so many things that get in the way, or many times where prayers are created to serve us, to serve our relationship with God, but we begin to serve them, and we just begin to do them out of duty and obligation. But then there's something about doing it out of duty and obligation, even when we don't feel right, like it, that we're still exercising the right muscles, and they're still helping us have faith. And so there's this difficulty just to acknowledge, I think, about prayer, where it can be frustrating, where it can be, something that we weaponize at times, that we use as a forum for gossip at times, that we oversimplify sometimes, with, like you were sharing, Eric, with emojis and kind of like, oh, God bless you. Yeah,
it's like lip service in some ways.
And so that's where it does become a complex thing, because we're like, well, it's simple, but not easy. So how do we continue to press into that conversation? And I think that's, finding this in, what the author said in that, article, especially kind of leans into, some of those realities about prayer. So,
and it's right. It's simple, complicated. I think it's like there's different dimensions to it, different ways of looking at it. And I think that's where it feels complicated in the simplicity of it. And so I'm not sure. I think part of it is looking back for me, like where I've struggled with it is how our culture has viewed it and presented it. And I think for different people, it can feel different ways. So for me being like pretty self-aware, I'm very aware of myself, like in situations. So even like in prayer, I tend to overthink it, even if I'm by myself or if I'm praying in front of 25 people. And I think there's this piece that's developed through our culture. I think how we were even raised in our, like, I don't know if you would call it like a church of origin, like how they prayed. And I grew up pretty conservative in a conservative church. And so it was like always feeling like, okay, am I doing enough? Am I saying the right things? And then I think a very worshipful conversation with God turns into a very human self-esteem, self-confidence struggle.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, that's kind of like my origins with it.
Yeah.
And then it becomes, I don't know, it feels like a fight sometimes. And then I find myself envious of, man, even Alex can like get up and just like say these very like, sorry to put you on the spot, but like, I mean, I like being self-conscious, like Alex can pray in front of 1,200 people and say things that I feel like, wow, like I don't even know if I could say that in front of 10 people. And so that's where I think the struggle is for a lot of people is you're overthinking it. That is completely not even the point of prayer, but it gets a front row seat to whatever we're doing or thinking. And that has no place in that, you know?
Yeah, I grew up in a church that when they prayed in service, they prayed in King James English with lots of these and thous because supposedly I think that was the only way God could hear it clearly. But yeah, I think we do pepper in our own experiences and into these situations. And it's, I mean, I even think of like public prayer. I mean, working at a church, this is maybe asking the question, where do we struggle with prayer? I think if I am being honest, we have a lot of opportunities, which I'm so grateful for. I mean, you can't think of another workplace where you're just like, oh, let's stop and pray about that. I think that's so good. But then sometimes it can feel very organized, you know, like, oh, we're going to pray around a circle and everyone's going to say something. And I'm like, oh man, I'm feeling like a Pharisee right now because I'm getting ready to like have my flowery prayer and outdo the person sitting next to me, you know? And I think that's where it sometimes is a struggle for me because you do have all, like you said, Jess, you get inside your own head and start being very self-conscious about it and also thinking, oh, I need to make sure sounds impressive or I sound spiritual or I sound whatever. And like, I know for me personally, that is not how I pray. I mean, it's maybe more of an ongoing dialogue in my head a lot of times, you know?
Right.
And so it's just not, I don't know. It's just different, you know, the formal version of prayer versus like my personal view on prayer.
Right. And then I think another part of the struggle is the Bible talks a lot about prayer. I mean, it's used as examples many times. And so there's certain verses that even as we're talking pop into my head that are intimidating, like, and probably completely out of context, but the verse that talks about like pray without ceasing.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, it's hard for me sometimes to pray for 5 minutes. And so, yeah, just being honest.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and that's where I think it gets complex when we think about prayer. If I will say that I probably stole, a lot of my thought. I recently read a book with my community group called Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools by a guy named Tyler Stanton, and just a really incredible book on prayer and really stretched me in a lot of different ways. But I think that's where, you know, the idea of praying without ceasing is we think of prayer as like it's an interaction, like it's just, okay, one interaction and going, but prayer is a part of an ongoing, we talked earlier about marriage and relationships, like prayer is an ongoing relationship, you know, where you're able to know where you are, you know, with a person at all times, you know, with your marriage, for example, or, you know, a family member or a friend. It's like this ongoing dialogue that you're able to continue to have with the person, comfortability, with that person, kind of where you stand with that person. And so it's not just a transactional thing that oftentimes in a formulaic world we want to make it. Like, we want formulas. And I think that's what's difficult. We are people that are like, well, just teach me, tell me what to do.
Yeah.
Just, God, if you would just tell me what to do, then I'm going to do it. And one of the things that Tyler talks about in that book that I really resonated with is he says, one of the most frustrating aspects of Scripture is that it rarely reads like an IKEA instructions. If God would just lay it out step by step, then I just do it. But for some reason, he's determined to speak in stories, analogies, and riddles. And I think that forces us into a deeper relationship with God. But we really do want, like, especially I think sometimes in our faith walk, formula, because so much of our other life is formulaic. You climb the corporate ladder, you eat this food and your body will change, you flex this muscle, you do all those things. And so much of our life is built on formula that we want our spiritual life to be that as well. Or at least I do. I'm prone that way. So,
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when we start to talk about what genuine prayer looks like, I think that can be kind of messy to try to just almost create a formula, because I don't think that's what we're intending to do, but to maybe leave it a little bit open-ended, that maybe prayer looks different for different people in the way that they interact with God. I think a lot of times for me, it just feels like this one-sided conversation that I rarely experience much in return, but I'll hear people like psychiatrists and counselors talk about how most of their job is just to listen. They're not there to talk a lot. And I think so much of what prayer is for me is kind of revealing, my fears and my humanity and the things that are actually scary for me to talk about with other people. And so when I'm praying, that sometimes the more I talk, the more I'm just revealing that stuff to myself in some ways. And I think that can be really helpful. But yeah, we can either use examples in our own personal lives, or what are other examples in the world you've seen? Is there just this genuine prayer? I mean, I always grew up hearing, traveling evangelists come into the church and telling you to get in your prayer closet and seek God's face. And I never had a prayer closet. But yeah, what does it look like? Can it take different forms?
I think answering the question, what does genuine prayer look like, also can be dangerous.
Right.
Because somebody could be listening to us and it's like, okay, you three tell me what that looks like. And if that's not it, like I just feel like there's a lot of judgment or expectations that can be created. And when I think about this, I think about, like, one of my high values is authenticity. So I would rather see someone's raw and genuinely who they are versus like a front, because I love that person. And I think of genuine prayer and how God looks at me as like that, where it's like, you don't have to be like Alex or Eric or somebody else. It's like, I want who you are, and what is that? And so I think for me, that's part of it, is like coming as I am with my own words to God, as part of it. And then I think genuine prayer looks different for other people. I just was sitting with someone with a group of people with someone that's in hospice. And we said, like, let's pray. And somebody said, like, Jesus. And that's like all we said, because nobody could really say anything else. And we didn't have any other words for that. But in that, like, in that moment, and I just felt like God was there and present and hearing our prayers. And it reminds me that we don't have to have everything, that God genuinely, like, doesn't need necessarily our words. Like, we can be thinking things and he knows our hearts. And so I also think, like, it's precious to hear, like, one of my kids pray. And I'm like, man, you don't need to have these, like, fluffy words, but it's like, how are you coming? And I think like you've said in the past, Alex, like, what's your posture? Yeah. And so a lot of times I think more about that, like I'm real and genuine. And if there's a few, I don't know, curse words in there, like God can handle that. But it's just like, what's that? That to me is being authentic and coming like as you are is
Well, I mean, we're delusional to deny that God doesn't know what we need or what we want, and so I think of you as a parent, the few times that something was going on in my child's life that was so, it was impacting them so greatly and emotionally that it just ended up with them in an embrace and crying, Right. I maybe didn't know what was going on, but they just needed to share it with someone. You work through it, you get to that point. But I think with God, it's like he knows. He's like, okay, I know my kid needs something, right? Like they're going through something right now. And so even that example is great, I think, Jess, where it's like, just even being present is more than I think some people allow for, because they don't want any silence. They want distractions so they don't have to feel anything.
Yeah. And I love that word, being present, that you both brought up, because I think prayer is about presence more than about anything else. It's about being present with God and acknowledging that God is present with you. And so I think more than anything, prayer is really about presence. And what gets complicated is that it's mysterious. Like God, this omnipotent, omnipresent God, like we just don't have a concept to understand how that God could be present with us and in our words, and that we're preferring his presence, like that we're taking something to someone although they already know. And there's like you were sharing, like with your kid, like there's just something that creates, a bond when you already know something, about your kid and they come and share that with you. You know, like you know a struggle that your kid's going through, and there's just this difference in you going and knocking on their door and saying, hey buddy, what I noticed you're down and this happened, versus them bringing that to you, and just the trust that's built there, and you feel like you can just parent differently, love differently in your response to that person than, so if God was always, breathing down our neck, knocking and saying, I know what you did, I think that just eliminates the value of saying we rely on him and we trust him ultimately to take those things, to him. Because I think at the end of the day, trust is a huge currency when it comes to prayer. Do I actually trust, one, that God is there, that he's listening, that he cares, that this is worth the time, that he cares about me? We get in these comparative games of like, well, that's something silly to pray about when other people have these things, going on in their lives. And so then, too small of prayers, I think, or what we think are too small of prayers, are things that keep us from going to God. But that as a father, I step back, I'm like, there's not anything too small that I don't want to know about my kid's day, or and maybe there's times I project that. And if I do, that's a hard issue on me, but this God that is all loving, I
always regret those moments when my kid's excited to tell me something and I'm not in that place to give them the attention, and you do seem dismissive and you don't mean to be, and then you look back on it and it's like, I wish I was paying attention. I think another thing that plays into this when you talk about, is it too small or is it too big, is pride. And I think for me, I'm very proud of like what I can do on my own. And that's in the real world all the time. The likelihood for me to reach out for help is so slim. Like my lungs will be full of water before I finally ask for that life raft, like I just have too much pride. And I think in my prayer relationship with God, like I think it's the same thing, because I'm like, this isn't really worth bringing up. Like I can take care of this. I can Google it. I can watch a YouTube tutorial. I can talk to people. I can make phone calls. I can use my influence. I can use my personality. I can do something within my means to control this situation. And my pride limits me and prevents me from having that conversation with God over and over and over again. And that's one of the things that I know for me, I have to work on, because it's like, why not just talk about it, because you're too proud, it's just, and so that's another interesting thing that this article brought up is, are there things that are too big or too small to pray for? And I think that's kind of a really interesting, because we're not going to bed every night, maybe praying to cure world hunger, or do you pray for every little, hangnail and that sort of, I don't know, but you wonder, what is that balance? I mean, going back to, I think the kids is, maybe that's a tough analogy for some people, but I know my son will talk about anything and everything for a very long time. And my daughter is kind of the opposite. We have to pry, to get something out. But like you said, Alex, as a father, you kind of want to know, So maybe the small stuff isn't too small.
Yeah. I think one of the aspects about prayer, and we're not the only ones asking this question, is Jesus had some guys he hung out with that were confused by prayer and what does it look like. And so they asked him, hey, teach us to pray. So if there's a simplistic kind of place, if you're like, how do I pray? Like, what does that look like? We commonly refer to it as the Lord's Prayer in Scripture, which is found in Matthew 6. And I think one of the cautions of that is sometimes like we think we're memorizing the words is what Jesus was trying to get at. And so we memorize the words in English as if Jesus spoke in English anyway, like we're doing it. And so, but I think he was giving us this template of how to approach God. And I think there's a lot of powerful stuff in there, but I think it begins by acknowledging like who you are talking to, and not in like, and the kind of like, it says fear is the beginning of all knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of all knowledge in Proverbs. And that kind of sounds like this weird fear of the Lord is the beginning of all knowledge. It doesn't make sense, but it's not like fear in like a sense of I'm afraid of God. It's like fear in a sense of if I run into that ocean right now, like this is just overwhelming. Like I have this proper view and respect and awe of what those waves could do to me. And if I ride those waves right, and if I treat those waves with the right awe, then they're going to do a lot of good things for me and I can enjoy those. But if I don't approach those waves with the right amount of respect and awe and just reverence, then I'm going to get rocked. But I think when I approach my prayer understanding, and oftentimes I don't take the time to understand like who I'm talking to, like this God, like you said, he already knows, yet he delights in hearing, and yet anything that I'm taking to him is something he can handle. It's not something out of his control, outside of his purview, outside of his knowledge, outside of what he can deal with and shoulder. And so I love that part of the Lord's Prayer is just acknowledging our Father and where he is and the hallowedness, like the holiness, the separatedness that he is. We don't have another word in English that really encapsulates what's being said there in the word hallowed. But I think it's a good place to start as our posture, towards God and understanding that. And I pray differently when I remember who I'm talking to and the vastness and the glory of this God that breathed galaxies, and like, okay, I can breathe a little more taking it to him. This isn't as scary. Yet it's that fear, that proper relational fear that I should approach him with.
Yeah.
So I think, is there a certain way to pray? Not necessarily.
No.
But I think we see in the Bible, that prayer is mentioned frequently. The Lord is praying frequently. I think that's something like we need to be, like that's modeled for us as Christians, so praying frequently. And I think another thing that you brought up, Alex, that we see is like we can pray about anything. and everything and for everyone. And to be, I think that we see promptings of that in scripture as well. And so I also think it's like our posture, like being humble and having a heart that's open. I think that's how you pray. Now, what those words are or even your attitude towards it is something that I think is moldable. And God, when you're doing that, God can soften that heart and he can change that heart, and his spirit is powerful.
Yeah.
And I think a few of the places that in Christian culture, and that's why I kind of hesitate, like in that conversation, Jesus taught us the Lord's Prayer, for example, that we've kind of gone wrong is we have taken those words as if they're magic, you know? And so we take those words and we recite those words that are given to us as a gift by Jesus to give us a template, to give us a model, like, hey, here's a good place to start. And then we start to serve those. Like that template is designed to serve us, to serve our spiritual walk and to give us a template of like, hey, here's where I can start and here's where I can continue to go and here's where I can acknowledge my need for daily bread and my need for God and my need to remember I've been forgiven and I should forgive others, like some of those things that happen in prayer. But we take that as a formula to be repeated, and then all of a sudden the words become meaningless. They become shallow. And so there's so many formulaic prayers. Like, I mean, I think of our dinner prayer, you know, that we, you know, typically say the same prayer, you know, every night. And it can become so formulaic. The words are powerful, but they lose their meaning when they just become obligatory in a lot of different ways.
Is it one of those rhymey prayers?
No, not rhymey.
Oh, okay.
Not rhymey. And now that my kids, you know, pray, like we invite them if they want to pray, like they don't say the same thing. But like I typically when it's dad, like I'm just like pre-programmed and I have to like, yank myself out of that in some ways because I just go there and part of me is like, okay, that's good. Like that muscle is there. But at the same time, I have to check my heart of like, okay, I'm just doing this to do it. There's absolutely no connection there. You know, it's like waking up and just telling someone you love them because you have to say those words rather than meaning those words.
Yeah.
I think another place like that we can go wrong is, for me, even growing up in just very conservative, and also like at the same time going through a lot of hard things. Like as a kid and in high school and college, it's like when you pray, God answers. And I've even had people tell me, like, I still remember it like 15, 20 years later, like, oh, well, you didn't have enough faith. You didn't pray enough. And so the harder and the closer I've like leaned into God in my imperfection, I've seen like that I was living like my prayer life equaled God's blessings and God's faithfulness to me. And I think for me, it's a lot of times that's kind of like how it goes. Like, okay, something bad is happening or we're going into the season, we pray for it, and it feels like it kind of rides on our, like the balance of, okay, was that a good enough prayer or was that not? And so it feels like, and I've had to battle through that of like a failing for me isn't because I failed God or because I didn't pray enough, but I think there's that tension that comes in prayer that's like a mixed message of, well, you didn't have enough faith or you didn't pray hard enough.
Yeah. One of the terms you hear often in Christian circles is a prayer warrior. So whenever something is going on, they'll be like, well, we should tell so-and-so about it because they're a prayer warrior. How do we feel about that term? It feels often to be used in reference to older generations a lot of times. I think of my grandpa. My family would have called him a prayer warrior all the time. Like,
it feels like something to aspire to.
Yeah. But so it's just one of those things that is that a real thing, or is that just a term that we kind of came up with to describe someone that we know has a really consistent prayer life, I'll say. Any thoughts on that? While you guys are thinking, it's just one of those, I think it becomes a bit of Christianese or Christian culture term, and that's maybe where it ends. It maybe doesn't really have much power in that name, but it is something that we use. Maybe it's more of a term of endearment to those kind of faithful saints.
Yeah, Wikipedia says prayer warrior is a term used by many evangelical and other Christians to refer to anyone who is committed to praying for others. And to me, when you're talking, I'm like going back to the beginning of this conversation when we're talking about prayer hands and like praying for you. A prayer warrior is somebody that actually prays.
There's a prayer behind that emoji.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you know when you ask that they will pray for you. And I love, it was a practice we've done like on our church page where when like there was prompting, I don't remember if it was you, Alex, or another minister here, but when someone asked for prayer, just challenging us, like instead of saying praying for you, to write out like a short prayer of like what that would maybe mean, not super long or anything, but to me, I feel like a prayer warrior follows through.
Yeah.
I mean, instantly I hear that word, and probably because I've been raised in church, like faces come to mind for me. Like and a lot of people, and I think it's a lot of people that I know. I mean, there's some of the most humble people I know. They're just people that I know are going to be interceding for me if I have something. Like on Wednesdays here, at CCC, for example, like people submit prayers all the time online, and we have a prayer room that someone can come to during our services, and everything that's submitted, that people, click the right box and are willing for us to share that, with our prayer teams, or a lot of times without a name, but they are there faithfully praying, and, praying with a posture that there's like an expectation in the prayer that they have. Like, not like, hey, like if you had a chance, if you're not busy, but it's like, no, I believe that God can do something and will do something, and that I'm like fighting in some way a battle on behalf of somebody, that there's a spiritual world that's out there, and there's a spiritual battle that's going on, and that I think maybe that warrior imagery is from somebody that is pushing back the forces of darkness in some kind of way. And there's people that are doing that every week on Wednesdays, Wednesday mornings here. There's Sunday mornings before, there's people that gather in the prayer room at church before any service. Nobody knows about this, and they're laying hands on whoever's preaching and praying for all the kids ministry that's going to happen, praying for everybody that walks in those doors. They're faithful saints that aren't being loud and boisterous, aren't looking for a title, And so I think maybe those are where the differences are, because there are people that are like screaming prayer, crazy warriors doing ninja kind of stuff out loud for everybody to see. And maybe that's the image that some people have, but I'm thinking of like
ninja stuff now. Yeah. Now I'm curious what they're doing.
Not ninja, like just kung fu prayer.
Are you thinking of like Ninja Warrior?
I mean, it's just like aggressive.
Yeah.
Like they're just they're in a shouting match with the devil. And like I grew, and maybe that's the charismatic circle I grew up in. And like definitely. The louder you are, the more God's going to hear it. And like, but now I've come to realize like the people that I picture now are just like the most modest, humble people that I can trust. Like, hey, if I've got something going on in my life, and I can trust that when I ask you to pray for it, like you're going to take it to the Lord.
How should we respond when prayer doesn't work, or at least we perceive it to not be working? Like, hey, I've been faithful. I've prayed about this. I've sought God about it. I've asked others to pray about it, and it is not changing. God is not taking this affliction away from me. God is not changing my life circumstance. God is not healing this relationship. God is not softening this other person's heart. God is not whatever, fill in the blank.
Listed it all.
Yeah. And it's just one of those things where I think people struggle with it. I mean, Jess, I know you're a Garth Brooks fan.
Yeah.
One of my favorite songs.
Unanswered Prayers, baby.
Prayers. Yeah, it's a great song. it's very surface level, but it is one of those things
know.
where I think of that sometimes. I'm like, oh man, I remember really wanting my circumstance to change in this way. And if God was some sort of genie and would have interceded, how much worse my situation would be in that moment, And so I think there is perspective there that can be gained from looking at it that way. But then I think there's just also the fact that we live in a fallen world. There's just really kind of challenging, maybe hurtful things that happen because I always think back to my mom. She was just someone who I know she was always praying for her family and she was always asking God to heal her. And that just never happened. But it's just one of those things where you wonder, how, like, I honestly struggled sometimes to even see how she could stay so faithful all those years, because just to not, there'd be little glimpses of hope here and there, but just to maintain that faithfulness, I don't know. How do you, because we were not promised healing this side of heaven. We're not promised those things. They do happen at times.
I feel like that's a big question too, because it's going to feel different for everyone. I mean, but for me, I think looking back, like I've had a lot of unanswered prayers, and I feel like have watched like things disintegrate around me. And I think that's made it really difficult. But I think, like, even looking back in hindsight, I feel like it made me long for something more long lasting than what I knew was in front of me. And I know that's hard to put in every circumstance. And so I think how we interpret this will be for each of our own in our relationship with God. But I feel like it made me long for something more, long lasting, and realizing that Jesus and the comfort that he gives me and the promises to walk with me through those things are more long lasting and enduring than a prayer that I wanted answered. And I think that's like a thing to wrestle with. Like, that's kind of where I've come through it. And he doesn't promise that he's going to answer every prayer, but he does promise that he will walk with us and that he will satisfy our needs and that he will be faithful. And so I don't think God not answering a prayer is easy, but I think walking with God and having a relationship with him, that's where it leads us, is to that deeper relationship. But it's not, I think that God also sits with us and his spirit groans with us when things don't work out and when prayers aren't answered. And he is faithful in that too, but it feels like a complicated part of a relationship sometimes.
Yeah. I think, and you brought this up earlier, Jess, but Jesus had a prayer life, and often in Jesus's ministry, it's just interesting as we, like Jesus, he's the model. He is God in the flesh, and walked around doing some miracles, walking on water. He had a lot of power within him, but then he also acknowledged like that came from the Father. And so Jesus oftentimes, it would say, withdrew to lonely places so he could go and have conversations with his Father. So almost after every miracle, if you're reading the Gospels, you'll see that Jesus withdraws. And so he can go and be with the Father again and again. And so Jesus, in his perfection, still realized a need for the power of the Holy Spirit, for a communal connection with his Father. And so he often, did this. And so it's encouraging to me to know, one, that, and discouraging in some ways too, to know like, man, Jesus needed prayer. How much more do I need to, take things to the Heavenly Father in prayer, and that he was practiced in this. And yet every prayer of Jesus was not, I ultimately was answered because of how he submitted to the Father. But I mean, if you're even thinking like before his death, like he's asking if could you do something else? Like he's in the garden, he knows what's about to happen. He's going to be arrested. He's going to be killed. Like, he knows how the story plays out, and even so, he's like in the garden and saying, hey, could you take this cup from me? Like, I don't. This isn't something I want to go do. The suffering that I'm about to have happen, I don't want. But, he ends it. And I think this is where, you could debate whether his prayers are all answered. But he says, not my, will, but yours be done. And so he continues to submit it back to. So he's not afraid to ask his petition, but yet at the same time, he's not afraid to continue to say, but there's something bigger than my will and my desires at play here that I want to submit to, which I think is so much easier said than done.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. How can we be better, or more consistent in our prayer life? Are there any practical kind of applications that we can think of? Because I think we tried to avoid being very prescriptive with what genuine prayer looks like, and I don't think we're going to try to get there right now with this question, but I'm wondering if someone's going, I forget, or I don't have time, or I don't know how. I mean, what are those hurdles that maybe we can help people remove? I know, Alex, one thing I was always kind of struck by that you said you do is have like a reminder that goes off on your way to work or on your way home from work to kind of remind you to pray and center yourself and pray for your family, because you don't know what type of scenario you're walking into. I think that's something simple where technology can kind of interface with our prayer life. If there's something like that for me, anytime I can incorporate some technological thing into a practical thing in my life, it helps me, because it's just the way my brain works and I find it interesting and it's something new. So I don't know. I mean, that's a very simple thing, but are there other ways that we can incorporate prayer? I mean, I think praying with family is maybe one that you could do, or setting aside a certain time of the week, even if it's not every day that you have this specific time.
And I think it's how do you best connect with God in prayer? Is that through also listening to worship music? Is that journaling? Even looking into like, what are the different types of prayer and connection with God? Because I think a lot of times from all of our backgrounds, we'd say, well, how do you pray? And we'd all come up with maybe like one standard thing of like, okay, well, you pray before dinner or before bed. But there's many other different ways to connect with God through prayer. So it's like, what fits your brain? Even like, if you have ADHD, it's going to be hard to like stay focused and maybe connect on like words for, okay, I'm going to pray for 15 minutes. That's not maybe realistically how that's going to look, but what does that look like? Another thing I do that's like super easy, similar to you, Alex, is I drive home the same way from work. And so I have picked a landmark that's like 4 to 5 minutes away from my house that I drive by every day. And so now that thing, when I see it, prompts me to pray or to pray for something specific. Sometimes it changes. Usually it's for my family or for my day, the people that I encountered. But I think it's being creative too on what does that look like? What works for your day?
Yeah, I think one is everybody's going to be in a different position when they're thinking about what is the next step. Like for some people, man, they're like, I do it every day, 30 minutes a day. Like I am talking to God. And for that person, I'd say maybe go start with 25 minutes talking and 5 minutes listening. And that's going to be difficult, especially if you're always used to doing all the talking and none of the listening. That's going to be a stretch, but for some people, it's just simply knowing that, starting with knowing I am beloved, like that this God actually loves me. And I think there's a lot of fear, and some of that's born out of, like we talked about earlier, our own experiences, our own family experiences. Like even that word father for some people is triggering because they cannot associate being loved with father. Like it's just it's a traumatic word for people. And so maybe it's not having to use that and trusting that the Lord will redeem that in some way, but it's beginning, with that, and beginning with not the end in mind, not with the petition in mind, but knowing that I'm adored and loved by this person that I'm taking this to, and maybe sitting and spending time imagining, I think there's a lot of imaginative prayer things that you are able to do. I think typing out prayers, one of the things I'll try to do is, rely on Siri to pray, to not pray, but to
dictate,
the prayers that, so instead of, somebody, one of you brought this up earlier, like in that moment, somebody asks you to pray for them, not just like, yeah, I will, or hearting it, but like typing that out or dictating it and sending it to people. You'll get some humor in there sometimes if you don't read over it all the time, because Siri's not always accurate. But like in that moment, pausing and sending it to somebody. Another thing that, my wife and I started practicing was we don't often like praying as spouses and things like that is something that I think is important. And I think for marriage, it's super important. And we were like, man, sometimes there's days we don't see each other as much, like in that kind of mind frame and things like that. So we've been like praying for one another on Marco Polo, like every day. And so like, I'll be driving to work and I'll say a prayer, for Erin. And then, later in the day, she'll pray for me back. And there's just something different about using that medium of like hearing their voice. And like, honestly, there's something that is emotive in me, like hearing my wife pray for me. So I know, like I've known that she prays for me and she knows that I pray for her, like just throughout the day, but there's just something different about that connection about, oh, here's the words and here's the specific prayers that they're praying for me. And so I think some of those are just maybe good next steps. And I think lastly, like, I start with the Lord's Prayer, not as a formula, but as like a, not about word for word memorizing the prayer, but saying, okay, here's the posture I can begin with, knowing who this God is and kind of working through that in your own words every day, I think could be, a powerful thing as well.
I think for me, even on a practical standpoint, I start to realize how often I do the equivalent of a child ignoring their parents and sticking their fingers in their ears and going la 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 la. Because I think to your point, Alex, about listening and making that space for listening to God in prayer, how important that is. And I will find anything to fill the silence. I mean, podcasts on the way home when I could just be sitting in silence. And some of my most profound moments can happen in that, or at late night, sitting on the couch, scrolling through TikTok when I could just be sitting with my own thoughts and talking to God and listening for his voice. And I think so many times, at least in this culture now where we have a device with us or we have some sort of an entertainment at our fingertips at all times, we just try to block out any of that, because there are some things that we're going to be confronted with in prayer that are not going to be comfortable. They're going to be painful. They're going to make us feel anxious. They're going to make us feel something, but hopefully maybe that will start at prayer, but it'll also end with prayer in the long run. And
sorry.
Go ahead. No, you're good.
I was going to say one of my favorite and also most convicting, you saying that reminded me, quotes is by John Piper, and he talks about Twitter, which no longer exists, but Facebook's still there. But
X.
He said one of the greatest uses of Twitter and Facebook, and fill in the blank with whatever,
TikTok
will be to prove at the last day that prayerlessness was not from a lack of time.
Yeah.
And so anytime I read that, I'm a bit shook and remind myself of, and not saying we're not at all saying like Sabbathing and doing things like outside of just talking to God is, you can create and be co-creating and be in God's presence and do all that kind of stuff. But if we're honest, there's a lot of things that we're doing maybe to avoid. Yeah. And maybe it's because our own insecurities, our lack of wanting to be loved, our lack of knowing how to respond to God's love. And so there's, for all of us, probably different reasons for not wanting to be in that silence. And maybe it's a fear that, what if he doesn't say anything? And so that's scary.
Well, and there's undeniable benefits to prayer and centering yourself and focusing on God. I think the series that we're going through as a church right now is flourishing. If you haven't been following along, you can catch up with that on our website. But I think there's a lot of connection there, even when places like Harvard are doing studies and realizing that people in faith communities are flourishing and healthier than people who are not. And prayer is such a huge aspect of that. And I think there's health benefits to it. There's mental benefits to it. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure we could list a lot of benefits to prayer, but I think sometimes we run to the next fad or trendy diet or exercise program or pill or whatever that might be. And not that all of those things can have their place, but I think maybe we start with prayer and then go from there. That's going to be on a t-shirt because it rhymes.
Start with prayer, go from there.
Yeah.
I like it.
Okay.
Maybe producer Austin will make that shirt for you.
Or yeah, we'll put it in the uncomfortable merch store right alongside the stickers.
Yeah.
No. Thanks everybody for listening. This has been a great conversation. It's reminded me of all the times recently where I'm like, I have filled my heart and soul with stress and chaos and not left any room for prayer or silence to listen. But if you have any questions or concerns, you can always email us. Send us an email to podcast@cccomaha.org. You can reach out to us on social media on Instagram or TikTok at CCCOMA podcast, or leave us a voicemail. We'd love to hear from you. You can dial the number 402-885-9930. Even if you have one of those old rotary phones, you could still call us and leave us a voicemail. But until next time, we'll talk to you then.